Great. So yeah, it's great to be able to present in this forum. It's my home community, of course, and so I'm really happy to be talking today. Um, I'll let you know that this talk is something that I'm going to be giving at a workshop at IEEE VR later this year. That's organized by Phil Art and some other of his colleagues, and the workshop is about XR for industrial and occupational support. And so I am going to go through some projects from long ago, some from very recently, and some somewhere in between that all are kind of about using XR in industrial contexts, where industrial is defined pretty broadly. So let me say actually a few words about this title. Always try to have a catchy title. And so I couldn't come up with a good acronym this time, but I did come up with 5 I words. So immersion, interaction, and intelligence for industrial insight. And that made me think about I-5. So I don't know how many of you have driven on Interstate 5 in California. Maybe, I don't know, I could ask you to raise your hands virtually, but I don't know if I would see them or not. Anyway, um, that seems like a pretty good metaphor for XR, I think, because probably the most traveled section of I-5 is in between Silicon Valley, the technology capital of the world, right, and Hollywood, the entertainment capital of the world. And so that's XR in a nutshell, right? We have this advanced technology, and the use that most people know it for is gaming and entertainment, right? But I-5 is not really all that glamorous, even though this seems like a glamorous route. In between Silicon Valley and Hollywood, you mostly see this. So it's pretty bleak. There's not a lot to look at. It's not like driving along Highway 1 on the coast or anything like that. There's not a ton. You see some places to stop where there's In-N-Out Burger, for example, and I might stop there. I think maybe the most famous thing along this route is this pea soup restaurant, which I don't know why that's famous. Pea soup is not good. But anyway, right, it's not a super glamorous sort of route. And that's really kind of what I want to talk about today. I don't want to talk about the kind of flashy uses of XR. I want to talk about these kind of more mundane industrial uses of XR. But to people who do research in this field, maybe they are exciting. So. Um, Kind of the theme of these projects that I'm going to talk about is complex judgments in industrial domains. And so one domain I'm going to talk about is scientific or medical data analysis, where you have this very complicated, very organic, perhaps very dense sort of spatial data. So, imagine that you're looking at medical data with blood vessels and you're trying to search through that data to find where a blockage might be located. And then you're trying to make judgments about it, like what parts of the body are going to be affected by this blockage and how do we safely address it or do surgery on it, things like that. So if we're doing this sort of data analysis with spatial data, we obviously have to have really good spatial understanding. We need to know where the vessels are, where they intersect, where a blockage might be viewed, and we have to make very fine-grained spatial judgments. Could we get our instrument in this space, for example? So that's a hard one. A second domain I'm going to talk about is advanced manufacturing or additive manufacturing. And so there are procedures in advanced manufacturing where they're printing really complicated parts in 3 dimensions, right? And so that one on the upper right is like a lattice structure that might be a 3D printed part. But somebody needs to inspect that structure and find out, does it have any defects? And if so, where are those defects and what type are they? So the little piece on the bottom left there is just a tiny piece of this overall printed part, and we need to be able to find this strut that's broken down here. So that requires spatial understanding again, but at multiple scales, right? We have to understand the macro scale and the micro scale. Again, it requires fine-grained spatial judgments, and it also requires domain expertise. So the inspector may not be expert enough to know what sort of defect to look for or what might have caused such a defect. And then the third domain I want to talk about is completely different. It's intelligence analysis. So the work of people in intelligence agencies, or you might think of the work of police detectives, or even the work of historians, right? Where the task is to analyze a large set of abstract information that's usually contained in documents. They might be text, there might be photos, and other things. And the question is, what do all the information in these documents point to? Is there, for example, evidence of a hidden plot? If so, what is that plot and who's involved? And so this has very different requirements, right? It requires finding and extracting information from a large set of documents. It requires organizing, linking, and comparing information. And it requires synthesis of all of that extracted information so that you can make a hypothesis about what's going on and then testing that hypothesis by, again, looking at the documents. So the kind of thesis of this talk is that XR systems are ideally suited to support these sorts of complex judgments. And this goes back to the title. There are kind of three I words that explain why XR systems are good for these sorts of tasks. And the first is immersion. So I'm going to use the term immersion in this talk to mean the objectively high level of fidelity of the sensory experience produced by an XR system. So in other words, when you're in virtual reality or augmented reality, the objects that you see really look three-dimensional. They have the same, they have high fidelity geometry. They appear to be fixed in physical space, right? Not just in display space. And all the visual sensory information that you're getting is consistent with what you would see if those objects were really real, right? And so this high fidelity, this immersion, can aid spatial understanding and fine-grained spatial judgments, like the requirements of those first two domains I talked about. It can also, for the third domain of intelligence analysis, it can provide space to think. It can provide space to organize, compare, and remember information. And then finally, especially on the VR side of things, immersion can actually reduce distraction and increase focus because it can replace the real world with a much more calm and simple virtual world. So that's the first characteristic of XR systems I want to talk about. The second is interaction. Not a surprise that I'm going to talk about interaction. I run the 3D interaction group. And I'm going to use that term here to refer to the ability to directly manipulate the objects of interest in an environment using high fidelity and, quote, natural body movements. So in other words, when we're interacting in XR, we don't need to interact through intermediaries often. We don't have to use complicated devices. We can interact directly with our hands in three-dimensional space. And hopefully all those skills that we've learned interacting in the real world will translate to the virtual world. And so this can also aid spatial understanding and fine-grained spatial judgments because you can, as you're moving an object, you understand the movements of your hand, and therefore you understand the changing views of the object and therefore its spatial configuration. It also can aid comparison and hypothesis testing, right? You can put two objects next to each other. You can try to overlap them. You can try to understand what the differences or similarities are between the objects. Okay, and then the third I in XR systems is intelligence. And so over the course of my career, a lot of the XR systems that we have used and designed have not been very intelligent, but with the kind of new AI revolution, there's lots of opportunities to build in AI features. And those features, right, can observe the context of use. They can know about the user. They can know about the environment. They can know about the task that the user is doing. And based on those observations, AI can potentially make inferences that will predict how it should adapt the system. And so we'll see some examples, but this means that XR systems now can support human judgment through AI assistance that automates tedious tasks, or that provides recommendations to the user, or that detects the user's intent. AI systems obviously can also provide human-like expertise if you use AI agents inside an XR system. Okay, so these are the three kind of pillars that I'm going to talk about. And so just to, again, go back to the title, the thesis is that XR can provide immersion, interaction, and intelligence, and that those can lead to industrial insight. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into kind of three sets of projects. And the first set is really old, actually. And this was looking at lots of different sorts of scientific or medical data in 3D visualizations in XR. And so this has been done for a long time. The picture on the left is a system from the late 80s. Steve Bryson did this. Oh, the name is completely escaping me now, but he was looking. Oh, the virtual wind tunnel. So right, so he was looking at airflows around aircraft and spacecraft in VR. On the right is a more modern example using a VR headset for looking at proteins and other sorts of similar biological data. So I was actually inspired to get into this from a paper that I saw in 2004 at the VR conference. And this researcher, Kenny Gruchala, was trying to apply VR to oil well planning. So there was a visualization of underground space, and then the paths that oil wells might take through that space, through the geology, to try to understand where they should be placed in order to maximize production and increase safety and things like that. And so he had an existing desktop application, which you see there on the left, and then he built this immersive VR application inside a cave-like system. And he showed in a user study that users got some real measurable benefit from the cave-like system. They understood better where things were. They were able to navigate better to areas of interest and so on. So this was some evidence that this quality of immersion was beneficial for this sort of data visualization. So we did some similar work. I had a student, Philip Schuchart, who was interested in caves, not the VR caves, but actual underground caves. And he was a cave mapper, so he would go crawl around inside these caves and try to develop detailed maps of them. And then he wanted to visualize that data in VR, and it soon became obvious that this data was really hard to understand outside of VR. So just on the desktop, this didn't make sense because we're not used to looking at this sort of data or understanding it. So he did the similar thing to Gruchala. He built this cave application where we could view this data and navigate around it and make judgments about it. And so we ran a similar study. We compared the full cave application that you see on the right to kind of a stripped down version of it that you see on the left, which just used one screen and it didn't have stereo and it didn't have head tracking. So it was basically like a big desktop computer screen. And again, he found some real benefits as people did tasks in here. Some tasks could be completed more quickly, some could be completed more accurately when you had this higher level of immersion. But that caused us to think about like what is causing these benefits. And so this is some work that Ryan will recognize because he worked on this with me way back when he was a student here. And so we thought about, well, there are really different sorts of fidelity that VR systems provide. And we organized them around this user-computer interaction loop that's shown here. So the user's on the bottom, input devices and input interpretation on the right. There's a computer system that is rendering some data from some model, and it's rendering that onto display devices, which are then shown back to the user. So in different areas of this loop are different sorts of fidelity. So the most obvious one is display fidelity, right? So if you have like a really high-end head-worn display, like the Vario headset that's shown here, that is higher fidelity than a laptop screen in lots of ways, right? It has more pixels for one thing, right? It's got a wider field of view. It's got head tracking that allows you to naturally view different parts of the scene. It's got stereoscopic rendering and so on, right? On the other side of the loop, we have interaction fidelity. So how close is the interaction to what we would do in the real world? So an example here would be something like the Virtuix Omni, which is this omnidirectional treadmill that you can use to run around physically in your VR video games. That is way higher fidelity in terms of locomotion than just using the arrow keys on your keyboard to move around. Okay. And then the third category is what we call scenario fidelity, which has to do with how high fidelity is the environment and the rendering of the environment, for example. So you see two shots here of the same scene, one of which is very kind of cartoonish and low polygon, and on the right, one that has high quality textures and much better geometry and things of that nature. So those are all parts of scenario fidelity. So we defined those objectively in terms of the degree of exactness with comparison to the real world for both for display, for interaction, and for scenarios. And we thought about different aspects of VR systems and how they fell into those different buckets, right? So display fidelity involves things like field of view and resolution and stereo and so on. Interaction fidelity has to do with things like head tracking and hand tracking and the techniques that you're using to navigate and manipulate the scene. And scenario fidelity has to do with things like model detail and graphics quality, physics realism, and so on. So I'm not going to go in depth into all of these, but just to go back to our kind of industrial domain of scientific or medical data analysis, we definitely see effects of both display fidelity and interaction fidelity here. So for the characteristic of immersion, which is related to display fidelity, for this underground cave visualization example, we did a more detailed study where we varied individual components of display fidelity. And we had findings that showed that when you're doing these fine-grained spatial judgments, that things like a wide field of regard, that is being able to turn your head and look around 360 degrees, as well as stereoscopic rendering, were both beneficial for difficult small-scale spatial judgments. So there was a quantified benefit of immersion. Similarly, in our work with Jake Soha's lab on beetle tracheal systems, where we were again trying to make these difficult spatial judgments, we again found that stereoscopy was kind of the thing that made the biggest difference. So you're trying to separate these tracheal tubes in depth. The stereo rendering really allowed you to do that effectively. Okay, so those are both benefits of immersion. We also found some benefits of interaction, of natural interaction, in particular head tracking, right? So for both of these domains, we found that when people could move their heads around naturally to view different parts of the scene, that made it much easier to make these fine-grained spatial judgments. So for example, on that top image, we asked people if that blue tube that's circled actually connected to the lower level tube. And we can see in this picture that it doesn't, but from many other points of view, it looks like it does because it's really close. And so being able to move your head around to find that view where you can see the gap is a real benefit of natural interaction. Okay, so overall, we did a bunch of studies here and we found lots of empirical evidence that some components of fidelity, both immersion components and interaction components, really give quantifiable benefits, especially when you have complex data sets like the ones that I've shown and difficult spatial tasks. And our studies actually couldn't say why, but the hypothesis would be that you get these higher quality visual depth cues from things like stereo, you get higher quality body-based cues from things like head tracking, and that leads to improved spatial understanding. And also, as you are navigating using head tracking or by manipulating using your hand, if you have these natural techniques, you don't really have to think about that navigation or manipulation. And so your mental workload is reduced. That gives you more cognitive resources to do the actual data analysis task. Okay, so again, some older projects that show why immersion and interaction can lead to insight in these domains. So I want to jump now to a much newer set of projects, and this is work that was funded by Lawrence Livermore National Labs over the last few years. And so these folks were working on, again, additive manufacturing and additive manufacturing of complex parts. And they said they wanted to use XR to help inspect those parts. And so how does that work? Well, they would print a part physically, right? Then they would scan it with a CT scanner. So you get a virtual model that's pretty exact of that 3D printed part. And then they wanted to compare that part with the CAD model, the ideal model, to see as they were overlapped, can we see any differences? In other words, any defects in the printed part? And so the first question we asked was, well, just how do we do that alignment? We have to do very precise alignment in order to see those defects. And so we thought about, well, what sort of interaction techniques would allow us to do that? So let me show this video, which talks about a couple of techniques that we developed in our lab. So the first, there's two techniques. They're called AMPIT and Wisdom. And you can see here kind of the task is to take these proxies for 3D printed parts and move them around until they're aligned. The way that AMPIT works is it's a 6 degree of freedom technique. So you're using a controller to move around in space, and that moves the object. But it's actually, let me just go back for a minute here. It is looking at the speed of your hand movements to determine how quickly the virtual object should move. So if you move fast, the virtual object kind of moves with a one-to-one mapping. If you move slow, the virtual object moves with a much, much larger CD ratio so that you get very precise movement. The second technique, Wisdom, also has this kind of 6 degree of freedom mode, but then it provides you with these widgets that give you independent control over single degrees of freedom. So you can manipulate just the X, Y, or Z, or with these rings, you can rotate the object around, yaw, pitch, or roll. Franciele Rodriguez, who is here again as a postdoc, is developed these techniques and ran a study back when she was here as a student that looked at those techniques with alignment of simple objects, those cubes that you just saw. And then more recently, we reran that study using more complex objects like the ones that actually come off the 3D printer. And the interesting thing, this paper will be published at VR this year. The interesting thing was that when we used these more complex objects, we got different results than we got in the original study. So in the original study, the Wisdom technique was kind of better all around for aligning these cubes. But with these complex objects, it turned out that that there were some issues with both speed and accuracy for Wisdom because the axes of the object don't always align with the direction you want to move it. And so AMPIT turned out to have some real benefits there. So this natural interaction where you're just kind of moving the object with your hand and you're slowing down when you want to be more precise turns out to be a really nice technique for this sort of alignment. Okay. Another kind of sub-project here is answering the question, how do we ensure that all the components of a complex printed part have been inspected? So you've seen these parts that I've been showing, they have lots of struts, right? And the struts don't all follow along kind of a nice grid pattern. It's maybe really hard to remember which struts you have looked at. And so a hypothesis we had was that being immersed in XR, having, for example, stereo rendering, and having kind of direct interaction, direct manipulation of these parts would help you to remember what you've looked at. And so Sherelle Connor is working on this and is running a study or has completed a study now, and we're preparing the paper where we've got kind of two different versions of this these visualizations. So on the left, you see kind of the whole part, and you can click on a strut, and on the right, you see scanned version of that strut. And you can manipulate both of these visualizations, rotating them around. And this is the desktop version that kind of uses a mouse inside an XR headset. And then we also have an XR version, which you'll see here. And it's hard to tell what's going on in this 2D video, but we're doing stereoscopic rendering, and we're also manipulating the objects directly using the hand. and then selecting struts by touching them using a finger. And so the hypothesis here is that we're going to see benefits of both immersion and more natural interaction in terms of not revisiting struts that you have already inspected. A third sub-project here was about trying to navigate through these large 3D printed objects at multiple scales to try to look for defects. And so the question is, how do we navigate through the multiple levels of scale, even when those objects are both dense and homogeneous, right? So an object like this has lots and lots of these struts, and everywhere you look kind of looks the same. So how do you navigate? How do you not get lost? How do you remember where you've been? And so my student, Leo Pavinato, developed a set of techniques that he called PRIMO, Progressive Refinement for the Inspection of Multi-Scale Objects. And this had the idea of these techniques was, first of all, you could use a clipping plane to see inside the volume. We would define discrete levels of scale. So you would be at a high level of scale or a lower level of scale. And you could navigate between those. There were object-centered techniques, so we scaled the object and kept the user in place. And then we used these really rapid dash animations to try to keep people from getting simulator sickness. So I'll show you a video of one kind of version of those techniques. So the three yellow rods here kind of indicate where the user is supposed to go to look for the defect. And you saw that they used the clipping plane. You'll see another example here. They used the clipping plane first, kind of cut through the object to the location of those rods. Then they use this box to navigate to lower and lower levels of scale until they find the marked defect. So we ran a study on this that was presented at VR 2025, kind of comparing different versions of these PRIMO techniques. And what we found was primarily was that the technique that you just saw there, where there's this box that you can place anywhere inside the volume in order to define the next lower level of scale that you wanted to navigate to, that was the fastest and most understandable. So people could navigate to the defect very quickly, but they could also remember where they had gone and where they saw the defect when we asked them later. So here's, again, kind of a benefit of well-designed multi-scale interaction. Okay, I think I'm only going to do one more version of this because I'm going to run out of time otherwise, but one more sub-project of this Lawrence Livermore work. This is the work of Alexander Giovanelli. So they were interested in collaboration. So how do we enable synchronous and asynchronous collaboration between inspectors and experts? So inspectors, as I said before, might not have sufficient expertise to know what they were looking for and what the cause of a defect might be once they had found it. So we thought we can use XR to bring these inspectors and these experts together into the same space, right? So in a collaborative virtual environment. And we can do that synchronously, right? They can be in there at the same time. They can also do it asynchronously. So the expert could, for example, record some answers to a question that the inspector had asked, and then the inspector could view those recordings, the 3D recordings later. But then we thought, well, there's also a hybrid of these two things, right? So you might be looking at a recorded asynchronous data at the same time as you are collaborating synchronously. And so we define this kind of bicronous interaction in the middle, in between asynchronous and synchronous. So here's an example of what that might look like.
Recording that you're going to look for is from Singapore. It's going to be SGTF 0930.
All right, I'm starting it now. All right, I'll get started with it.
Hey,
All right.
this is Finn, and it is October 23rd, 2024 at approximately 9:30 SGT. Ensure that no physical damage has occurred to the nozzle. Thank you.
So hopefully you can tell what was going on there. So there was this synchronous interaction with kind of the orange avatar. They then loaded in a recording of this pink avatar, which is shown as a semi-transparent head and hands, which shows that this is a recording, but you can do both synchronous and asynchronous collaboration at the same time. And so Gio ran a really fascinating study to kind of see what are the effects of these different states of temporal collaboration on the user experience.
Reporting that
And um, he found that there were some downsides, right? So if you're in there with a live collaborator and you're reviewing the recording, there's some social pressure to go through it quickly, for example. There's also more occlusion because you just have more avatars in the space. But there were some real benefits as well. So information processing was improved. You had improved ability to recall information when you were working with a live collaborator as well as the recording. And you could understand the information presented because if you didn't understand something in the recording, you could ask the live collaborator, right? So this bicronous state had some real benefits. And I think that's another flavor of benefits from immersion. Okay, I think I'm going to skip through these last two parts and go to the last domain. So both of the previous two have kind of been about looking at complex spatial data, right? And so it's not really maybe a surprise that immersion and natural interaction are beneficial there. But in this intelligence analysis domain that I introduced at the beginning, where we want to do sense making in these complex document sets, it's maybe less obvious that that XR is a good choice. But what is that? What can XR do? Well, first of all, it can provide expansive 3D space. So you can do your sense making by organizing documents, by clustering documents, by linking documents, by comparing documents, and using space to do all of those things. And you do those interactions, those clustering and organization and linking and so on. You can do all of those with embodied 3D interaction. So that's natural and understandable. It's low mental workload. And it also helps you to remember, for example, where you've placed things because you have body-based cues to help you with spatial memory. And then the third thing that Chris North and I and others have been working on for several years here is these XR systems can provide rich interaction data. And that data then can be taken advantage of if you can develop models to understand that data to intelligently assist the user. And so I'll give an example of that coming up here. So here was an early version of what we call IST, the immersive space to think. And this is, a user who has been using it for a good while already. There was a whole bunch of documents. These are actually documents from a historic data set. We were working with a historian at the time and trying to understand what this collection of documents told us about race relations at the end of World War II. And so this user has taken some documents off the board, they've clustered them, they've given clusters labels. And so there's kind of this using 3D space to organize your thinking about this process. Here's another version that was done later in augmented reality, and it shows some of the features here. So not only can you move the documents around, you can highlight text, you can create labels and just type into them using a real keyboard that you can see because it's augmented reality. You can create notes as well in the same way. And of course, you can still do this kind of spatial manipulation to organize the documents. Okay, so we think that there are some benefits to this version that provides immersion and it provides natural interaction for doing this this sense-making task. But I guess what I would really want to get to is how can we use intelligence here? And so Ibrahim Tamid, another one of my students, asked if we could use gaze data that's already provided to you by the VR headset or the AR headset. Can we use that gaze data to predict what documents are going to be relevant to the analyst or to suggest documents that are related to my current document? In other words, can we use gaze data to build a model of the analyst's interest? And so I don't have a video of this, unfortunately, but Ibrahim developed this version of immersive space to think that gathered this gaze data continuously. And then it does a couple of kind of visual cues to help represent what it thinks the analyst's interest might be so that the analyst can follow those recommendations if they want. So one cue is just the color, the background color of the documents. So he has this kind of white to green gradient, and the more green the document is, that means it contains a bunch of terms that you have already shown to be interesting to you from your previous gaze history. And then you see on the bottom right that when you're looking at an individual document, you can click a button to get recommendations. So it looks at the terms in this document, and it looks at your interest model, and it recommends other documents that have similarity and that will be interesting to you as well. And it tells you what terms are shared between the two documents. And when you click on one of those little tabs, it provides a link to that document in the space. So these are kind of intelligent ways to help the user explore this complex space of documents based on their own interests that they've shown through their case. Okay, so I'm almost at the end here. I could have said a lot more about all of these projects, but overall, some lessons learned. So on the side of immersion, I think the question here is, like, when should we use XR? What sort of problems is it good for addressing in these industrial domains? And so there's a lot of different reasons here. So one obvious one is when you need to understand space or geometry or spatial relationships, right? Immersion helps with that. But also, like in the case of immersive space to think, when you can use space to effectively organize and analyze abstract information, immersion is also good for that. When information is better understood by situating it in real physical space, so with augmented reality in particular, if you need to correlate abstract information with locations or objects in the real world, right? Immersive systems are good for that. And of course, when interaction with spatial content is critical. And then finally, collaboration, right? So collaborative virtual environments can provide this very natural way for multiple people to look at, discuss, inspect different sorts of spatial content. On the side of interaction and intelligence, I think it's more about how do we design XR systems, right? So we don't get these benefits of natural interaction or intelligence just by kind of throwing an XR system at the problem. We have to design it well. So for interaction, some lessons learned, we need to allow freedom of physical movement, right? So those examples of where head tracking allows you to get exactly the view that you need. We need to allow natural manipulation of virtual content, and sometimes those natural techniques are pretty complicated to design. We need to then provide precise interaction based on natural input, which is sometimes hard to do, right? Because the natural input with your hands in midair, for example, is not inherently precise. So we have to, again, design carefully those interaction techniques. When precision is less important, just provide simple and direct interaction and support collaboration across different temporal states, like we showed in the Bikerness work. On the intelligence side, one example is providing intelligent expertise, maybe through an LLM when human experts are unavailable. Allow flexible organization and annotation of information, and then you can infer user interest and intent from natural cues, what they look at, what they point at, what they interact with. And then finally, use those inferences to adapt the system based on the user of the task and the environment. So we have a lot of ongoing work in these areas. As you may know, the primary research agenda of my lab now is in intelligent XR. So we're still working on immersion and interaction, but kind of intelligent immersion and intelligent interaction. So we're asking questions like, under immersion, how can we intelligently lay out content in XR so that it's easy to access while remaining unobtrusive? Imagine you're looking at 30 different apps or windows in an XR space. Can the system figure out how to lay out that content so you know where it is, you can access it when you need to, but it stays out of the way? For intelligent interaction, we're looking at reducing the need for precise input by modeling and predicting the user's interaction intent. So for example, with gesture-based interfaces, can we not require users to be super precise in their gestures, but build a model to predict what they mean by those imprecise gestures? And then just with intelligent features in general, things like we're trying to predict engagement or workload using gaze data and use those predictions to intelligently adapt the system. We're also looking at how AI could summarize what an asynchronous collaborator did in their previous session. So when a new user comes into the space, they can quickly get up to speed with the work that's been done. So those are just a few examples of the sorts of questions that can come out of this work. So I see we're almost at the end, so I hope there might be time for a question or two, but I wanted to acknowledge funding sources, collaborators, and students who have worked on this, and I'm happy to take your questions.